Hey everybody, welcome to the members live Q&A. So we're going to get started in just a minute. If as people are hopping on, I'm going to go ahead and start answering some questions. So just to share a little bit about how this works, basically why I hop in and do these live Q&As is to give you some additional clarity on all of the things that you're learning in the program. So I know that there's people from two different programs in here. There's the Language Therapy Advanced Premium and then the Language Therapy Advanced course. But really, we're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is to build our students' vocabulary. So the reason that I pop in here and do these Q&As is because I know that when I share that information with you, you're going to have some questions. That's totally normal to have things that come up as you are implementing the strategy. So that's why I pop in here. So how I handle it is, number one, I can always answer a question live. So if you have a question at any time during this next 30 to 60 minutes that I'm going to be on here, go ahead and pop it in the chat. If I'm in the middle of talking about something else, I may wait until I'm done, finish my thoughts, and then come back to it. But feel free to pop questions in there at any time. But usually how I start it is that I will have gone through and looked at some of the questions that have come up from members over the last couple of weeks, whether it be question threads in the Facebook group, whether it be comments in the actual video modules that you have. So you can put comments below the videos and ask questions that way, or whether it be just through email privately. So I like to go through and look at the patterns and things that come up a lot and just give you some additional clarity on some of those things. So I'm going to just go through, I'm going to just share some of the things that have come up the last couple weeks in the program. But as always, feel free to pop something else in the chat as I'm going through. So the main things that have come up the last couple weeks, some of the questions that have come up is, number one, how to cycle through semantic feature analysis. So how long to stay at each stage, how to actually work through that and cycle through it. So that's question number one, what I'm going to address first. I also have gotten some questions about writing evaluations, or not writing evaluations, but just doing evaluations, and how to take data and measure baseline data and things like that. So I'm going to talk about that briefly and then direct you to some places in the program where you can find that information as well. And then finally, there were some questions about the ultimate guides to syntax, such as how to get a good gauge on where your students are when you're working with things like syntax, because as you'll notice, it's sometimes hard to tell with language if a student has a skill, because we'll often, like, especially when you're trying to see if they can use that form in oral language, it's hard to actually get them to say what you want. One question that came up today was passive voice. So it can be really hard to figure out how to get your students to use those forms and to see if they actually understand them. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Paula is asking if there is, let's see, so I'm going to read the question out loud. I have to write a goal today for a student who's struggling with complex sentences. I feel like I have to teach each conjunction separately. I have your list of subordinating conjunctions, but wonder if there are materials out there that would help a student with learning about each one. Okay, so actually, since we're talking about syntax, I'm going to go ahead and answer your question first, Paula. So, honestly, with the conjunctions, I'm trying to think. I mean, there are a lot of different, besides the resources that I have given you, subordinating conjunctions. Yeah, it was probably an autocorrect fail, Paula. She said subordinating conjunctions, not subjective conjunctions. That's what I thought you meant. So I was assuming that. So I would have a running list of the or the subordinating conjunctions that you've used, and pick a couple key conjunctions that you have. In the goal, so let me know in the comments back, have you written a goal for this student about complex sentences yet? If not, I would say to not specify which conjunctions you want them to learn in the goal just yet, because that could be shooting yourself in the foot and making it almost too specific. Because what could happen throughout the year is that they might get certain conjunctions and you might want to move on to the next ones. And, oh, and he hasn't met it. Okay, so he still isn't getting the complex sentences. How long ago did you write that goal? How long have you been working on it? Sometimes, and I'm gonna go to, we're talking about the goal first as well, but while you're typing, I'm gonna also, as far as actually recommending specific resources, I would have try to pick out the most a year. She's worked on it the last year. You might want to, let's see if we can come up with some different variations of the goal so that your student can actually meet the goal. And then we might actually continue the goal that you have, depending on how it's written. So as far as resources, I would say, again, I keep losing my train of thought here. So I would go ahead and come up with just a list of conjunctions that you're going to cycle through. And okay, yeah. So I see your goal now. I would go ahead and just come up with some specific conjunctions that you want them to get and use the most common ones. So because would be a good one. Just pick, I would say, between 5 to 10 and focus on those. So use the probes that I have to come up with some examples. But what you really want to be able to do with your student is not necessarily go through those ultimate guides like a worksheet, but to use that ultimate guide just to give you a lot of different examples of different types of sentences. Ultimately, what you want to be able to do is have a list of conjunctions and be able to generate an activity from scratch from that list of conjunctions. So there's a variety of different ways that you can do this. So the specific techniques that you can use within that activity is that you want to do a combination of things like sentence combining, sentence deconstruction, and sentence generation. So seeing if he can, again, take two sentences and combine them together, seeing if he can just generate a sentence using that conjunction, and then seeing if you have a sentence together with that conjunction, seeing if he can take it apart and take out the clauses and then create two separate sentences with that from those two clauses, or maybe it's three clauses. And see if he can actually pull out that conjunction and explain what it means. And I would really focus on the same 5 or 10 and make them the ones that are the most common. So again, because it's a good one, because it explains why, and a lot of times our students, they are not, like they're not able to answer a why question because they don't know the word because, and a lot of times they're having comprehension breakdowns because they don't get that. So I would even if your teacher has, sometimes they have some word lists that they use for writing, so maybe just skim through some of those, but cross-reference that with the list of coordinating and subordinating conjunctions that you get in the program and see if you see some similarities and just pull some out and really focus on those. And yes, what you might find is if you are actually reading with that student, there might be some other ones that come up every now and then, and that's fine. You want to explain those as well. But really see if you can just focus on the ones that are the most common. So as far as activities, you really want to get to the point that you can be flexible with whatever materials that you have available to you. So whether it be those worksheets that I've given you, whether it be maybe you have different picture probes, maybe you are, watching a video on YouTube, maybe you are reading an article, and maybe you're coming up with sentences about what you just read or about what's going on in the picture. So that's another way that you can just take that list and just come up with sentences about whatever is going on, about whatever you're talking about. So that's a way that you can add some variation there. But with your student, I mean, you want to do a mix of doing that orally and written as well. I'm assuming he's a little bit older. All right. So he's good with and, because, so, and however, but really doesn't get words like although, unless, until, while. Yeah. So here's the interesting thing, Paula. It sounds like he has made progress if he's getting some of them. So that's a good thing. So I would say that I would tweak the wording of the goal so you're not just writing the goal over again, but just work on some different ones that you used in the past, and obviously work those common ones that he gets, work those in too, but maybe add some of those more difficult ones in. So let's see, past goal was student will use grammatically correct complex sentences using a variety of conjunctions, prepositions, and adverbial clauses when given a word bank. So what I would do with that goal is, I know I tell you to be as efficient as possible, and if you can combine something without, making it too hard to track the goal, I usually recommend doing that. But I think what is going on here is that there might be too much in that goal. So he actually has made progress with part of it. So I think in your progress update, report what you just did for me and say he's gotten these, like he gets these conjunctions, but we're going to keep working on these other ones. So yeah, it sounds like he hasn't met the goal and it's not perfect, but you can at least demonstrate that there is some progress, and you could even show some data on those specific conjunctions. So this is why it's really, really hard to write language goals that are objective, but that are also actually functional. So you've got to kind of meet in the middle there, because what we're finding here is that you would have, for you to be objective about that, you would have had to write a goal for each specific type of word. Like you would have had to write a goal for each conjunction. And that's crazy. That's not realistic, which I think is what you were asking, if you should do that. It just makes it really hard. It makes it really hard for your students to do and for you to track. But at the same time, if you go too general, then we run into what you're struggling with right now, where it's like, well, I made it general, but now he's made progress, but I can't demonstrate that. So I would just take that data on the ones that he does know, and then use that to show, like, yes, there was progress. What I think we could do with the goal, what you could do to add some variety is you could add a receptive goal. So you could just focus on, okay, let me think out loud and say your goal. Student will use grammatically correct complex sentences using a variety of conjunctions, prepositions, and adverbial clauses when given a word bank. So why don't we, because he's making progress on the conjunctions, why don't we condense that goal a little bit and make it just about the conjunctions and take out the other stuff? I would be working it in and giving exposure for it, but don't worry about measuring it right now, because I think it's making the goal a little bit too, it's making it kind of a mega goal where you've got too much in there. But I would focus on the conjunctions. And the there's a couple ways you could go with this. So you could do expressive goal and receptive goal. And with the receptive goal, you could say something like, we'll answer questions about sentences with 2 or more clauses, or actually, no, we'll say we'll answer questions about complex sentences with 2 or more clauses. And that way you can see if he's actually understanding those sentences, and do that only if he is struggling receptively with that. So that's one way you can do it, and one way that you can make it so that the goal is attainable, because he might be, for some of those more difficult conjunctions, he might be starting to get them, and he might implicitly have some understanding of them, but he might not be able to actually articulate that and use them yet. So you could do receptive goal, and then we can do an expressive goal and just take out that stuff about the prepositions and adverbial clauses and just target that under a goal about complex sentences. And you don't necessarily have to say what kind of conjunctions, because it's inferred that it'll be a subordinating conjunction if it's a complex sentence. And so what you could do in there, I mean, one way that you could specify, like you can write that goal. One way that you could specify specific words is you might say something, you can do a for example. So kind of within the goal, when you say, we'll use complex sentences with a variety of conjunctions, just say something like, for example, and then list a couple of the more difficult ones that he hasn't gotten yet. So that way you're making it specific enough, but you're not saying I'm only going to work on these conjunctions, because then if he gets it, then you can move on to other ones and target other things under that goal. So hopefully that made sense as I was going tangentially and talking through that. So again, cut it down to just work on the complex sentence with the variety of conjunctions, and then add a receptive goal, and report data on the conjunctions that he has made progress with, because it does sound like he has actually somewhat met part of that goal, because he has improved on some of those conjunctions. Okay, so I'm actually going to go do something different than what I said, because I was just talking about syntax for Paula's question. I'm going to go to my other question that I got earlier today about passive voice and just how to measure whether our students understand it and just how to evaluate. So I'm going to go into that a little bit. So one of the questions I got is that with those probes that I've given you in the ultimate guides to syntax. So part of the reason I put them in there is because people ask for them, and they want to have some type of a baseline or some type of a, initial assessment of where their students are when they start working on something. So yes, those are things that I have done clinically with my students. So one of the questions was, that it's hard to get your students to actually get that you want them to use passive voice with some of those probes. And do students ever actually figure that out, that that's what you want them to do? So the answer is yes, but it is absolutely not a perfect assessment tool, but it is something that you can use as an attempt to elicit passive voice. You might end up having to do multiple examples for that. You might end up having to model it a couple times. I know, yes, does that technically sort of help them and cue them? Yes, but sometimes, there's just certain evaluation tools, even with the standardized tools, that you'll read the probes and you're like, there's no way that any reasonable person would actually be able to figure out what I want them to do here. One example is the spelt 3. So that one gives you a measure of whether or not students are able to use certain grammatical structures and certain syntactic structures and certain types of vocabulary. But some of those probes, you're reading them to your students and you're like, like, I wouldn't even get this question right. How is a kid supposed to figure this out? And then there's certain ones on there that, I mean, there's a couple at the end where they're supposed to give you an embedded relative clause, and it's like I think I've had one kid ever in like 14 years give me a correct answer on that one. So yeah, the more involved and the deeper that a language evaluation tool goes, whether it be something informal like the one that I've created for you, which is by no means a tool for diagnosis, it's just for getting more information because it's not standardized, whether it be something like that or whether it be even those formal tools that we use to diagnose, the more in depth that you go, the less reliable and valid it is, because it's just not as straightforward, because you have things like that happen. So what you can do, so just to answer your question about the passive voice, my recommendation is try it, but you might have to model a little bit. And if you're really hitting a wall and you're like, I think they might get it, like I'm pretty sure they might sometimes have passive voice in their oral language, I would try some other means. One of the other things that you can do to evaluate it is just do it receptively. So don't show them a visual, but say a sentence with passive voice and then ask them a question about it and see if they can answer the question correctly. And there are a lot of examples of those in your ultimate guides to syntax. So that's one thing you can do. It at least gives you a measure of whether they can do it receptively. Not the same as expressive, but it gives you some more information. Or something else that can be very useful is a sentence imitation task, similar to what is on the told and the self on certain subtests. And the reason that this works, sometimes it's like, well, but you're just telling them the sentence. Doesn't that affect their ability to generate it on their own? Yes, but what happens a lot of times with sentence generation tasks is if you don't have the sentence structure that the person just said to you in your repertoire, and if it doesn't make sense to you, what's going to happen is that it's going to be really hard for you to remember it, because that structure will not make sense to you at all. So you'll probably forget it. Or when you repeat it back, you'll repeat it back incorrectly. You might repeat it back the way that you would have said it. Or a lot of times with passive voice, they'll repeat it back with active voice, with the like the agent and the action switched around. So that is another way that you can assess it. Again, no assessment tool is perfect, but these are just things that we can use to get some type of baseline. And remember, with any of these things that we're working on, you know, like you have your evaluations that you're doing that are going to give you your nice, neat standard scores that you're going to be able to put on your reports to diagnose and say whether a student qualifies. But I mean, let's be honest, that's not, it gives you a guideline as far as what to do with your students, but good therapy is diagnostic. You're going to be writing those goals, but then you're always going to be fine-tuning the way that you work on those goals. So if you've got one goal to improve your students' syntax, and you're finding as you're working with students that they have other syntactic structures that they need to work on, you know, you can be doing those little mini evaluations and probes and like doing therapy and taking data on what the actual student is doing in therapy. You're always gathering more information. So don't worry if you don't have perfect information in your evaluation when you're starting. You just want to be, I mean, you just want to do your best. Like if we were, like if you know, the nice, neat way they want us to take data, like in the schools or for insurance or whatever setting you're in, like it's impossible to do it the perfect way. We just have to make it work, because language is messy and it's not this perfect, nice little discrete thing where we can just check a little box or put a little X or check mark to say whether or not the student did it. But we do try to meet in the middle as much as possible. So even like if you have a goal for one syntactic structure, but you find that there's this other one that they're struggling with, and you can kind of work it in, or if you think working it in might have an impact on another syntactic structure, a lot of times that can happen. You don't just have to stay rigidly within this goal and only do that. So hopefully that helps. So those are some suggestions for working through that kind of thing. Okay, so we talked a little bit about passive voice. We talked about the specific question about complex sentences and tweaking that goal that Paula had. I'm going to go on and talk a little bit more about the evaluation tools and how we can work through that. And then I'll talk about the semantics last. So that, look, I kind of going backwards to what I said I was going to do. Okay, so evaluation tools. So what I wanted to just share, again, there's two different programs in here. And just to share this information with all of you is that we're in kind of a transition with Language Therapy Advanced now. There's some of you who are in the one-time course. There's some of you who are in the membership. That's a monthly membership. A lot of the information is the same. We are working on streamlining some things. So that's why sometimes I might say, if you're in premium, go here for this piece of information. If you're in the course, go here. So just to put this out there, I am going to be sharing some information about just the actual program and some of those housekeeping things. But to answer the question about evaluation, if you are in premium, a lot of the questions about evaluation tools and how you can get good data and how you can write goals are in the SPOT framework and the trainings that cover what's in the SPOT framework. So the video training on aligning goals and the video training on goal writing and data collection. So that's where you want to go if you're like, how do I measure this? How do I write a goal? And how do I make sense of an evaluation based on the things that we're working on in here? So that's that's where you can go. If you are in the one-time course, I am in the process of adding that information in there, and I'm going to be adding a 7th and 8th module. So that's going to be up within the next couple weeks. And you're going to want to look in your materials library for something called the SPOT Framework Guide. So because I do have a lot of questions about that, I am going to be adding that in for you guys shortly. But my quick and dirty answer a lot of times is when people have goals for high-level language things, or maybe they realize when they come into this course that they should be working on something that they're not working on, and they're worried that they're not going to be aligned with the curriculum, or that they're not going to be aligned with the students' goals, or that it's just not going to make sense based on the evaluations. So the evaluation procedures and the way that you write your goals, we're just making tweaks here to what you're already doing. A lot of the things that we cover in this program are what you do as a result of that evaluation and how you get to the goals. It doesn't mean that the evaluation and the goals is going to be completely different than what you're already doing. It might just be some minor tweaks. So think of the techniques that you're doing in Language Therapy Advanced in this framework as your vehicle for getting to your destination, which is your goals. So that means that the goals, while you might tighten them up and specify them a little bit, maybe you're working on some specific syntactic structures now and you're writing some goals for that, but it doesn't mean that your goals for answering WH questions or even those reading comprehension goals, it doesn't mean they have to change completely, because you are still ultimately working on something that is going to improve your students' ability to be able to do that. Because working on syntax should improve comprehension, and because working on vocabulary should improve comprehension, then you are still working towards that goal. You're still aligned with the curriculum. So you don't necessarily have to have this complete overhaul, because you're still, the end goal is still the same. You're just getting there a little bit differently. So, tweak those goals, maybe add in some more specifics as those IEPs or treatment plans come up for renewal, but don't stress too much. But with evaluations, so, there's the things that we're doing in this program over time. Yes, they should eventually improve your students' ability to perform on some of those measures of vocabulary. So the standard evaluation tools that you can use while using this framework are the ones that you're probably already using. So for basic measures of vocabulary, you've got like the Peabody, the expressive vocabulary test. There's some other ones. There's the MAVA, the Montgomery assessment. There's the expressive and receptive one words, and there's a bunch of other ones. There's even the test of word finding. So those are the ones that are really, really straightforward. And you can absolutely, like if a student is low on any of those tests, you can work on any of these things in the program. I'd imagine if they are low on a lot of those semantic measures, you might be heavier in things like semantic feature analysis than maybe you would be in things like syntax. But it just kind of depends if that's just one thing, if that's really your student's area that's low, or if they're kind of low across the board. A lot of times, let's be honest, our students with language disorders, they kind of need everything. So we do have to cycle through a lot of them. But the thing is about evaluation tools like that is that, like, if all you're doing is naming and identifying a picture, it's pretty straightforward. I could do the test, and then somebody else could give the kid the test, and chances are our procedures, there would not be a statistically significant difference between what I would do and what you would do. And if we took a whole group of people, there would be pretty good reliability because there is not a lot of wiggle room in that in those procedures. The downfall of that is that there's a lot more to functional language use than just pointing at a picture and naming a picture. So that is the downfall of that. It doesn't mean those aren't good assessments. You should still do them because of the good reliability and validity, but then you need more. So you need things like supplemental pieces of information, like some of those informal things that I've just described. Those can supplement. So not diagnose, but supplement to give you more information about the direction you should go in therapy. Or you obviously would need some other things that are kind of in the middle there where it gives you more information, but not all of the information you need. So maybe you have things like the self, the told, the language processing test, the listening comprehension test. So tests like that dive into specific areas of language. So my go-to for the comprehensive, I like the told. The self is another option. I know that the self 5 has been criticized for not being sensitive enough to certain populations. It does give you a lot of information, but you just have to be aware that you might have to supplement it with some other tests. That's why I like to do things like the listening comprehension test, because it dives a little bit deeper and it's a little bit more sensitive than something like the self, but you can still use them in tandem. So really, I mean, you can use those tests to see the profile of if your student's low in syntax, if your student's low in semantics, and really get an idea of the goals that you should write and the parts of this language therapy advanced framework where you should maybe spend a little bit more time. Because even though I recommend for your learning that you kind of cycle through it, especially when you're first learning, and that's honestly, a lot of that is for your learning. It's certainly not going to hurt your students for you to spend a little bit more time on one area than maybe they absolutely need, because there's probably areas where they need the stimulation that you could work it in. But I mean, I recommend that you cycle through all of the techniques, but know that over time, you're going to get better at this, and you're going to learn where, based on your evaluation, there might be a certain piece of the process where you might say, like, we're going to kind of skim through these other areas really quickly and just hone in on this. Like for Paula's student, she might kind of cycle through semantics pretty quickly and then really, really hone in on syntax and stay there for a while. And then, maybe cycle through morphology really quickly, cycle through all the other stuff quickly, kind of see how he's doing, and then spend a long time on syntax again. So it's, again, there's not like you have to spend this amount of time with this strategy. And again, language doesn't quite work that way, but you're going to get better with it over time in making those clinical decisions. So that's how I view evaluations. You're going to still be using those tools like you're using before, but just be mindful of all those different areas that we're going to be focusing on in therapy, and just think of it as like, how can I match, like if a student comes out low in all of the language structure things on a certain subtest of any of the tests that I've mentioned, you're going to be honing in on those things like morphology and syntax. And if they're low on more of the semantic things, then you're going to be honing in more on the semantic side. Now, one of the other questions I get is, what about the phonology and orthography? Because a lot of the assessments that we have don't really dive into that. So this is something where I say it's okay. What you want to do there is look for that information elsewhere, and not think of yourself as the sole person that's going to be providing the language support for the student, but think of it as a team approach. So if you're in a school, you might be able to get some more information about their phonological awareness from some classroom assessments with orthography. That's tied into morphology, so a lot of times those go together. So if you know that they struggle with structure, just assume that you want to work in a lot of print exposure and work on morphology and orthography in there. But if they're really struggling with reading and spelling, that you're going to need to be working in things like phonology and orthography. Don't stress too much about having a specific measure for those areas, because again, it's just things that we are working in to improve on the measures that you're already doing. So hopefully that clarifies that evaluation piece. All right. So let's see here where what we talked about so far. So syntax, evaluation, passive voice, and so now we'll talk about the semantic feature analysis. So I've covered this a little bit, but the question was how quickly should I cycle through semantic feature analysis? So unfortunately, I wish I could be like, do it for this many minutes and this many sessions, but it doesn't quite work that way. But I can give you some general parameters to work around and some questions to ask yourself to be able to make a good decision for your students. So as I mentioned, you might be spending more time on that. Like if you know that your student is really, really low in semantics, and maybe they didn't have a ton of stuff come up on the syntactic measures that you've done, or maybe you don't have a reason to believe that's something that is as pressing, you can spend a good month or two working on semantic feature analysis and definition syntax. That's totally okay. You're not going to hurt your students by doing that, because what you can do is work in some practice on just sentence generation and try to work in some different syntactic structures that way. So don't worry about spending too much time on something. But if you do want to just have a plan going forward so that you know what to do, so you can kind of cycle through all of these different things and just know what's laying ahead for you, what you can do is, I would say for the first couple sessions when you're doing semantic feature analysis, you're really focusing on the process. So you're focusing on easy words that your students already know, and you are just getting them to understand like what all the different semantic features are and how to explain them to someone else. And the reason is because they might not know what a category is, or they might not remember the different order to do the self-questioning or things like that. They might not know what an antonym is if you're doing verbs or adjectives. So you want to get them familiar with that process and just be modeling that. And then once they've gotten the hang of it, and even if it's not perfect, because some of your kids might be like, yeah, we get it. Some of your kids might not be. If you've gone through it a couple times, then you can start cycling in some more difficult tier 2 words. And I generally recommend, having like between 1 to 3 words per week that you're adding in. And obviously the other ones, you might have a list of words that you've done before that you're kind of remembering and cycling back to. But again, it does get a bit messy because it's hard to get all of them in. But having that 1 to 3 tier 2 words per week that you're working into your therapy, you can start doing those more difficult words with things like semantic feature analysis. So that could even be, you could spend a week or 2 doing that. And then what you want to work towards within those couple weeks is getting to the point where you could, in theory, in a session, instead of spending the whole session on semantic feature analysis, because you absolutely could do that, is that maybe you're gradually phasing towards over the next couple weeks. You're going to be condensing it down and maybe giving your kids a really quick model of a word. Like, remember all these different things that we say to describe a word, giving them a quick model and maybe giving them a visual. And you're going to start working towards taking that information and putting it into a definition. So you should be about a month in. So like a couple weeks on the process, a couple weeks working on semantic feature analysis with specific words. And then you're starting to phase towards teaching your students how to put that into a definition. So when you're actually working on definition syntax and you make that transition, what you can do is when you're studying the words, you can even do like a really quick 1 to 2 minute semantic feature analysis with them. If they can't come up with the information on their own, you could probe a little bit and do that. But what you want to do is have all that information out there so that when you're like, okay, how do I, what does this word mean? They have all that semantic information from that semantic feature analysis, and you're able to say, okay, this word means this, and you're able to put it into those syntax templates there. So that's kind of your next step, is you've got all this semantic information and you're teaching them how to use it. You're teaching them how to take the relevant information and put it into a definition. So that would be the next step. So you can toggle back and forth between just doing a quick review of semantic feature analysis there, or having it already done for them, having a couple examples written out, and then putting it into a definition, or just going straight to the definition, because what they've got to do there is kind of implicitly think about all that semantic information in their head, sort through the relevant information, and put it into that definition. So it's not that you're not doing the process, they're just kind of doing it in their head implicitly. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's the sequence of the process. That whole thing that I just described, when we're going from the beginning of semantic feature analysis to working on definition syntax, could be done over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. Again, if you know that your kids are pretty good in semantics, you could condense that down into one session and then move right on to definition syntax and then move through the process. But if you're like, they're not going to get it, they need a lot of work on vocabulary and semantics, you could absolutely spread semantic feature analysis out for a couple months. So my recommendation for you is that, sadly, and I know that this isn't always the answer that people want to hear, but a lot of times just getting in there and getting your feet wet is better than like worrying about whether or not you're doing it right. Your students are going to be fine. It's going to be okay. It's better to make a decision about what you're going to do and just go with it. Be like, you know what, I'm doing this month. We're going to go with it. We're going to see what happens. It's better to make a decision and make the wrong decision and realize after that month you've got to just make some adjustments than to spend a lot of time stressing and worrying about what you're going to do next, or just doing whatever's comfortable and what you were doing before. Because at least if you're making the wrong decision, or maybe a decision that's almost there but not quite, you're at least moving forward. That's how you're going to get to that right decision. But we can't be afraid to be wrong or to do it wrong because otherwise you're not going to make any progress with your students. We've got to be willing to just come up with something and try it and just see what happens and then tweak from there. This is honestly what everybody's already doing. So you're just doing this more mindfully with more of a strategic process rather than just, kind of randomly doing whatever it is that comes up. So that's really the mindset that you can have with this, is that it's a framework. It's not a curriculum. And the reason for that is, like, a framework can structure you. It can give you some pieces that you have to have, but it's not like a scripted thing where it's like you do this for this length of time and this for this length of time, which curriculums aren't always like that. I know that that people that deliver curriculums are making tweaks and modifications as well, but it's more scripted and more structured than what we do because it is not individualized. And so what we need to do needs to be individualized. So that's how that works. So those are the main questions that have come up these last couple weeks. So we've got usually I go between 30 and 60 minutes here. We've been on for about 45 minutes. So what I'm going to do now, again, obviously, if you've got any other questions that have come up, then feel free to pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I'll keep going and I will go through a couple of the other questions that have come up. So on the topic of semantic feature analysis, it was actually kind of interesting. A long time ago, somebody asked a question about how to write goals for vocabulary. So if you scroll down in the group, you might see that. And it actually got pushed back up to the news feed because some people in the group had started commenting on it. So even though it came up sometime last year, it got a little more action and it's pushed up in the news feed in the group. And so the question was just, how do we do it? So obviously, again, I've already told you your SPOT framework guide is your go-to resource for writing goals. But because this comes up so often, I do feel like I address it on a lot of the Q&As, but I'm going to go into it again while we're on because it did come up. But the question is just, where do you start for vocabulary goals? So my starting point is always that goal of student will define or describe words with 3 to 4 attributes. And so that's your starting point. And I really advocate for that goal because a lot of times, like what I was talking about earlier with Paula with the syntax goal, where it was like, you start big, like that's your starting point, whether it be you actually write the goal on the IEP or whether that be during your brainstorm process when you're figuring out what goals are going to be on the IEP. You start there and then you look at the information that you have and see, do I need to make this goal more specific or not? If you're really not sure, it's better to just stay general and just take a stab at it, because if you go too specific, then it's like the goal might not be relevant. Just try not to do the mega goal that's absolutely impossible to track. So with that goal, with the define, describe, a word with 3 to 4 attributes, it's pretty specific about what the task is, but it does give you a lot of flexibility. Gives you a lot of flexibility on the attributes that they're going to name, the class of words that they're going to name, or whether they like the difficulty of the words. So, I mean, you can vary the type of, like, if it's a concrete noun, if it's an abstract noun, you can vary if it's a verb, if it's an adjective. All of that work can go under that goal. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it gives you a lot of flexibility with what you can work on with that student over the year. And what it also does is that as different curricular units come up, maybe there might be specific words that you know are coming up for your students that you want to work on. And that way you can work on all of those things under that goal because it's flexible enough that you can do that. But like I said, the goal is, it's flexible, so it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. Let's say that you get to the end of the year and it's like, okay, they get how to do this for concrete nouns, and they get how to name function and physical attributes, but they don't get category, and they don't know how to say a synonym and put that into the right definition structure for describing a verb. Okay, so it's like they've kind of met the goal, but they haven't. So that's the downfall of that goal. But what I normally do under that goal is when I come up and report the progress update, I just report the data on those things within that goal that they met. So for example, I might say like they've met this goal for concrete nouns and for this, this, and this attribute, but they haven't met it for this. So we're going to tweak the goal a little bit. So maybe we could make that goal a little bit more specific at that point. It's still that starting point, but we're just gradually fine-tuning it and tailoring it over time. So if you get to that point, like I think I even suggested, somebody in that thread had mentioned, well, I've got a student who's working on this goal and they get it for concrete, but I'm thinking if I should maybe pull out a specific attribute and just write the goal for the attribute. And so my first instinct was, no, don't do that. But then when we dug into the situation when I dug in and got more information, I actually said, wait a minute, no, actually, I do think you should do that, because she had been working on the goal long enough with the student that she really pulled out that the synonym and working on things like verbs and adjectives and being able to put a synonym in a definition and really get that specific attribute, that was something after working on this goal for a while that was really popping out. So in that situation, it absolutely makes sense to say, we'll define verbs and adjectives by giving a synonym of the word. And you could even say something like, we'll define a verb or an adjective by giving 2 to 3 attributes, and then in parentheses put, for example, synonyms, antonyms, context of action, or whatever, whatever example you want to give there. So that's the way that you can do it. And you can tailor it, and you can not be writing the same goal over and over again. And you can show that your students actually did meet the goal that they had. So I know some people kind of disagree with me about some of those things with breaking it out. I know that, like, I had a special ed administrator who one time critiqued my IEP, and she wasn't an SLP. She was trying to be helpful. So, it was fine. But one of her suggestions was that I had a goal where I think I had something like oral and written language was into one goal on syntax. And she said something about breaking that apart. And I was like, yeah, in some situations that might be appropriate, but you don't know the student, you don't know how I was doing it. So depending on the situation, I may or may not do that. Obviously, like if you've got somebody who is looking over your shoulder that closely, which she wasn't, she was just randomly pulling IEPs and trying to help us out. But if you've got somebody who's staring at you that closely, you do sometimes have to, abide by what they say to some extent. I think a lot of times, though, people think that they need to do something a certain way. And I think you've got a little bit more flexibility and power than you realize a lot of the times, because, and maybe this might be my personality, that I'm more of a ask for forgiveness rather than permission kind of thing, is that I found that with a lot of my administrators, I would, if I showed that I could just get the work done and figure out how to do it, they would let me do things the way that I saw fit, as long as they knew I was doing the right thing and I had earned the right to do that. So they weren't hunching over my shoulder looking at how I was writing my goals. They were just letting me do it because that made their life easier. They didn't have to worry about what I was doing. So just some thoughts there with goal writing with regards to making it more specific and making it to the point where it's not crazy to track them, but it's also something that's objective. Another thing that you want to think about when you are writing goals is that you want to think of it as a thermostat, not a therapy planning tool. And what I mean by that is that you don't need to write a goal for every single task you're going to teach your student. You just need to pull out the things that are the most representative of what that student needs to work on. So you might have a goal on syntax, a goal on the grammar morphology piece, and a goal on semantics, if those are the 3 areas that your student needs to work on. But it doesn't mean that the tasks outlined in those goals are literally the only thing that you're working on in therapy. You're going to be working on other things. Those are just kind of that representation or those gauges that you're using to show, yes, the student is moving along at the rate that we want, and the student is making a reasonable amount of progress. But you don't need to, I mean, I've seen people break these goals out like ridiculous and have this laundry list. Excuse me. And it's like, you know what? Like, you're not even going to be able to do therapy. You're going to be spending so much time doing your paperwork. And that's just not a good situation for anybody. So go with that mindset of, you know, like, you want to get them good enough. And I'm not saying that you should be like half-assed with your goal writing or anything like that, but you want to be reasonable and be legally compliant. But at the same time, remember that you're there for therapy and you're there to help that student get to do better in school. And if you're doing that, you're doing a good job. So with that, I think I've covered most of the questions that have come up. What I'm going to do in just a couple minutes here, as soon as I sign off, is I am going to post the CMH certificate so if you've watched this live Q&A, you can use this for certification maintenance hours and use that toward your certification maintenance for ASHA. So to clarify, CEUs and CMHs are different. This is CMHs. CMHs are hours from somebody who's not directly sponsored or affiliated with ASHA, so it won't link up to your registry, but ASHA will accept CMHs as well for your certification, for your certificate maintenance. So all you need to do is print off the sheet that I have given you and just use that to track your hours. If you're ever audited, you just have to show that. So obviously, state licenses may vary with the type of hours that they want, so you want to always be sure to check on that, but I know that it does work for ASHA. So with that, we are going to wrap up here. If nobody has any more questions, and yeah, I will see everybody else. I'll see you in the group, and feel free to keep the questions coming. And as always, if there is something, you know, always start a question thread whenever in the Facebook group. But if there's something where you're like, I really want you to talk through this on the next Q&A, let me know. A lot of times I'm taking note of your questions as they're coming up anyways. But if you're like, I really want you to answer this live, then let me know as well, and I'll make sure that I do that. All right. So have a good evening, everybody, and happy Wednesday.